In this game of very creative chess from Magnus Carlsen, we see a very fresh take and new way of looking at how white plays against the Scotch game. Magnus has the white pieces. His opponent is Andre Diamant. This game was played in Halkidiki in 2003. Now, the ratings and titles that I have for both players are current, not at the time of the game. So Andre Diamant was not a grandmaster when this was played, but he is now at 25-24, and Magnus was over 2,500 himself. Magnus began the game with the move e4, occupying the center and liberating the bishop at f1, e5, knight f3, knight to c6, and here bishop to b5 is a Spanish, bishop to c4 is an Italian game, but d4 was the move played by Magnus Carlsen. This is known as the Scotch game, immediately opening up the center of the board. E4, knight d4, and here g6 was played by Grandmaster Andre Diamant. More common is knight to f6 and also bishop to c5. But by playing g6, he wants to develop the bishop to g7 and control this long diagonal. These dark squares in the center have become a little more vulnerable now that ed4, the central pawn exchange, was played. Now, the most common way for white to handle this is to treat this like almost like it's a Sicilian and play knight to c3, bishop g7, bishop to e3, and then play queen to d2, trade off the dark squared bishops, and treat it almost like it's a Sicilian dragon. And what Carlsen does, now he plays c4. This has been played before, but it's very uncommon. It's been played less than 40 times in my database. Basically, he's playing it still like a Sicilian, but more like a Maroczy bind Sicilian, clamping down on this d5 square. An unusual way of handling this position, but not bad at all. Knight to f6 is played by black, obviously attacking the e4 pawn. Magnus defends with c3, d6, and here Magnus plays the move knight to c2. Now, if you've seen the Sicilian Maroczy bind, you know this knight to c2 move is actually quite common. And the reasoning behind it is this. In this position, white has more space. And the side with more space wants to avoid the exchange of pieces. They want to keep pieces on the board, and black could exchange on d4 here. So by playing knight to c2, Magnus is removing his knight from the center of the board so it cannot be exchanged and keep pieces on the board with his space. That's what he is doing. Bishop to g7, entering that long diagonal. Bishop to e2, castles, castles, and knight to d7. What black does in these structures is usually play on the dark squares. He's liberating the bishop, so he's unblocking this bishop, and the knight is aiming for c5, where it can put some pressure on this e4 pawn. This c5 square is often a nice square for a knight in these types of structures. Bishop to d2, so that if black does take on c3, he can retake with the bishop instead of having his pawns doubled. He probably doesn't have to worry about his pawns being doubled, but he prevented it anyway. Knight to c5, and he could threaten the e4 pawn with bishop takes knight followed by knight to e4. Whether that's a good idea to play that right now is questionable, but that is a potential threat on the board. So Magnus plays b4, immediately kicking this knight, and the knight chooses to go to e6. Now, there is a pin on this knight down the long diagonal against the rook, but what black is basically doing is he's putting all of his pressure on this d4 square. You see both knights and the bishop all aim at d4, and black would like to exchange pieces. If he could play a piece to d4, exchange it off, he'd be happy. Magnus moves the rook, getting it out of the pin from the dark squared bishop, knight e to d4. Now pieces will be exchanged. Knight takes d4, knight takes d4, and bishop to e3, threatening to take the knight. And here black could play c5, actually just trying to create a strong point on d4. That would have been perfectly fine, but instead he takes on e2, and queen takes e2. So black does have the two bishop advantage, but the space advantage white has is quite potent. White would love to trade off these dark squared bishops, say play queen to d2, bishop d4, then jump that knight into the d5 square, and white would have a very strong position in that case. Black first plays a5, and after b5, the c5 square is weak. The problem is black can't take advantage of it. If he had a knight that could go in there, then it would be useful, but it isn't very useful right now. So here black goes ahead and takes on c3. He gives up the strong bishop, but now the knight is not going to be able to jump into d5, and after rook takes c3, we have bishops of opposite color. Now, the truth being told, this bishop on g7 is very strong. Change that color. And this is probably a strategic mistake. You should probably keep that bishop and try to play with the two bishops for the time being. But he gives it up and creates a situation with bishops of opposite color. He probably was thinking that he really couldn't win the game, but with bishops of opposite color, maybe he could defend. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, be sure to hit the subscribe and the like button. So the next move Black plays is a mistake. He plays the move f6. Now what he's trying to do is gain control over the e5 square and basically create something of a wall on these central dark squares. The problem is he opens up this long diagonal aiming at the king. He weakens his own king, and Magnus immediately takes advantage of that with a very strong move, c5, allowing the queen to come to the c4 square potentially with check. After dc5, he could just take the pawn and he'd be in good shape. He could attack the c7 pawn, but instead he plays rook to d1, gaining a tempo against the queen at d8. The queen moves. And now bishop to h6, another strong move, aiming at the rook, but also taking away key squares from Black's king. That bishop on h6 is going to be very annoying for Black. The rook moves. And now queen to c4. Again, rook to c5 is fine. In fact, rook takes c5 was even stronger. The problem with queen to c4 played in the game is that Black could have played bishop to e6. And this is a defensible position for Black. Not bad at all. But he plays c6, and that leaves White with the better position. Magnus plays rook to d6. He obviously wants to double up on the d file. Also, he might be able to grab on f6 as this rook at f7 is pinned. Here, if Black takes on b5, then White could actually respond with queen takes b5. And if queen takes queen, rook to d8 leads to a forced mate. There's nothing he can do to stop it if he plays here. That's just mate. He could block it once with the queen. So instead of that, Black plays bishop to d7 to help try to keep this diagonal strong. Now here the best move for Magnus would have been b6, and he misses this move for a few moves, and any time he could have played it and it would have given him just a completely crushing position, but he doesn't play it yet. He plays a4, backing up that pawn. Here Black plays king to h8, but instead he should have played cb5, ab5, and after bishop takes b5, Black is actually better now. So that would have been the best way to go. So king to h8, and again b6 is the best, but instead he doubles rooks on the d file. Rook to c8, again cb5 was still the right way to go for Black. Rook to c8, h3 to give his king some breathing room, rook to c7, and now b6. Magnus sort of has to be forced into it in a way. It becomes a very obvious move once the rook goes to c7, and now White has a crushing bind on the position. The rook goes back to c8, as it must. Now, in this position, Magnus has a devastating blow. Can you see the tactical move he plays here? That's right. Queen takes f7, exclamation point. And when the queen takes the queen, rook takes d7. And these two rooks completely dominate the position, even though he had to give up his queen to attain it. He's just crushing. And Black can't move the queen, say, to a2, because then just check on the back rank. Game is over. Rook takes, king takes, and White would just be up an entire piece. So instead, Black plays the queen to g8. But now rook takes b7, and the idea is he wants to play the rook to d7 and double along on the 7th rank. If in this position Black played c4 in an attempt to irritate this rook and march towards the queening square, rook d7, c3, then in this position it would actually be a blunder for White to play bishop to g7 check. Even though it would win the queen, after queen takes, rook takes c2, and there would be no way for White to stop Black from queening on c1, and he would have to settle for a perpetual check with the rooks. But instead, after c3, he could just play rook to g7, and that would win because this bishop would stay in control of the queening square. So what Black does next makes sense. He plays g5. The idea is he wants to block the bishop's access to c1, so then that variation would work. He could play c4, c3, etc., and the bishop could not stop it. So Magnus plays rook to c7. if rook to b8, rook d to d7, and if c4, the variation doesn't work anymore because he's behind a tempo. And if he shakes, he just takes the pawn at c6, and the pawn can be stopped. So black instead plays queen to e6 to try to hold on to that c8 square, but rook d to d7, and after rook takes c7, you see the move, rook to d8 check. And that is the end of the game. Black resigns, and the reason is the only legal move for black here is queen to g8. You can't move the king, but after rook g8, king g8, pawn takes rook, and he cannot stop the pawn from queening, and Magnus still has a bishop at h6. A unique and creative way to play the Scotch game as white against the g6 move. I hope you enjoyed the game. Now, even after going over this great game from Magnus Carlsen, there's still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to see is in this video right here, so be sure to catch that one next for some amazing chess. Bye.